Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. I'm a schoolteacher from Barry's Bay, Ontario. Thanks to my summers off, I spend almost half of each August going on canoe trips in Algonquin Provincial Park nearby. Most of the park isn't wilderness by any means, as there are many logging roads. There are, however, many areas of the park that are protected and have no logging or infrastructure, and these are the areas I like most. Some of these areas are huge, bigger than most other provincial parks. This August I went on a solo trip to Lake Lavier to catch some lake trout. It wasn't exactly the season for them, as most lake trout stay in very deep water during the summer, but I was going to have a busy fall and figured why not attempt some deep water jigging. The trip began through the access point on Lake Opeongo, a large lake with branching arms that act as a popular canoe highway for backcountry access. Over the course of a few days, I made my way from Opeongo to Dixon Lake across one of the longest portages in the park and up to Lake Lavier. The lake was beautiful. When you first cross from Dixon to Lavier, you enter a bay, and as you continue on your way, it opens up to a massive lake that felt like a small sea to a guy like me who has never seen the ocean. Since this lake is very deep into the backcountry, you normally don't see many other campers. However, one of the only other canoe trippers there happened to take my favorite site on one of the islands. Because of that, I decided to try something new and camped on the lake's northernmost site. I set up camp and went fishing. It was extremely windy, so it was difficult to control my canoe. This is less of an issue when I have the weight of all my gear in the boat, but I had already set up camp. I decided to call it a day early and went back to shore before the winds blew me to the other side of the lake. I then had an idea. I was relatively close to a much smaller lake to the north of my site, connected by a very short and nearby portage. I grabbed my rod and a few small spinners and decided to head over to see if I could catch some perch or panfish from shore. It was getting late, so I wouldn't be there long. I made my way up the portage only to find it connected to a very marshy area. I went back and around the marsh, which was longer than expected. I started casting from shore as the sun was setting, not wanting to head back because of how long it took me to get there. It was getting a little nippy out, so I buttoned up my flannel. The lake was beautiful with the cold wind, that moment of beauty quickly interrupted by the sound of crunching to my right. The only animals that make sounds like that as they move about are bears and moose. Both are creatures that you don't want to bother. The issue was that this animal was in between me and the rest of the shoreline that would have guided me back to the marsh, and thus the portage, and thus my campsite. I decided I would cut across the dense forest to the shore of Lavier and find my campsite. I was glad I brought my flashlight because at this point it was very dark. I made my way into the forest, and after about 15 seconds I heard the animal again. I stopped moving and heard it continue for a second before pausing itself. When I continued, it continued, and when I stopped, it stopped. At this point I was absolutely terrified. I was shining my flashlight behind me, but couldn't see any reflecting eyes shining back at me. I swear I was just standing there with my flashlight for 2 minutes. I started speed walking, shinning my light back periodically in a slight panic. I didn't want to be eaten by what I thought was a mountain lion or bear. I finally tried scaring whatever it was off by yelling. I turned around and yelled, "Hey, back off," as if I was calling out to someone. My entire world shattered when whatever it was shouted, "Hey, back off," back at me, in my exact voice. This is going to sound absolutely crazy, but I then saw a bald white head with no ears and huge eyes look out from behind a tree, and I absolutely bolted through the woods away from it until I reached water. From there, I ran to my left along the shore until reaching my campsite. I threw literally everything in my canoe as fast as possible, picked up my tent with my sleeping bag and everything in it and just threw it in the canoe. I grabbed my backpack and water filter as well and threw them in. I got in and paddled as fast as I could, completely forgetting to get my bear hang. I had no idea where I was going, but my instincts were telling me to just leave. I found myself sitting in my canoe in the pitch black, not knowing where on the lake I now was. Most of my thinking was about what just happened. I didn't sleep that night, just waited in my canoe till morning. I had the balls to head back to my site and quickly grab my bear hang before canoeing to the other side of the lake where I would properly fold and put away my gear. I'm never camping on Lake Lavier again. Location, South Minnesota, on private property in farm country. The property was rather large and heavily wooded in areas, along with a small pond and steep stream bed. It was the beginning of November when I had my encounter with this monster. My wife and I had just finished cleaning up after our yearly Halloween party. We invite the entire family out and set up a haunted trail that the younger people in the family enjoy. It was 2 days after the party when it happened. It was about 8:50 p.m. and we had finally finished storing all the decorations and also moving our 5 horses up to the main barn from their lockout pasture. We had put them down there so we could use the main pasture for the trail. The horses did not make it very easy either. They bolted as soon as we opened the gate. We basically had to run the mile uphill to catch up. We set out fresh hay and locked them in since there was going to be a hard freeze that night. I had just put dinner in and was enjoying some television when my phone got a text message in the kitchen. I just got to my feet when I heard the horses raising all hell from the barn. I figured one of the farm dogs got locked in without realizing sometimes they prefer to sleep on the hay instead of carpet in their house. I grabbed my spotlight and went out onto my porch to find all my dogs there, all focused on the barn. I shined it down in the lockout pasture and saw the horses all on one side of the corral staring at the open barn door, stock still. I was still thinking they still had gotten spooked by something minor, like a bat flying around or tool falling off the wall. I yelled up to my wife, who was upstairs. "Something spooked the horses. I'm going to round them up. Can you help?" It took her a minute to reply. "Yeah, give me a few." I called for the dogs to come with me and started for the barn. My barn's layout is important to the story details, so I'll explain. It's built in the side of a small hill with the top floor level with the top of the hill. The bottom floor is connected on 2 sides to the main pasture and the lockout pasture. The horses were in the lockout pasture. The interior is one segmented room with a large loft and a gated area for the horses to come and go as they please. The loft we used for hay and feed. There was a window on one side of the loft wall which we keep open a few feet for fresh air. The top level only had one door and was for storing ATVs, hunting, and horse supplies, which is always locked. I walked into the barn pasture and the horses immediately trotted to crowd around me, almost pushing me over. I yelled and they backed off, giving me some room. My wife's mare, Cherry, kept rubbing her muzzle against me, eyes wide and terrified. I began to pet her in an attempt to calm her, but my hand came back wet with blood. I shined the light to her shoulder and a large and fresh gash that tapered into 4 parallel cuts. I immediately thought Bear and shone the light into the barn. Besides a few tools and some buckets thrown around, there was nothing. I figured it smelled some of the garbage left in the upper level from the party. I was about to start to lock the horses back up when I noticed a bale of hay laying on the floor, twine still on it. It was not there when I locked them up. I went ridged and shone my light up to the loft, expecting to see a black bear, but I could only see the first couple feet of the loft, so I had to climb up. I walked over to the ladder and noticed some dark gray hair hanging on a nail about halfway up. Right before I was about to climb up, I heard my wife behind me start to scream along with the horses whinnying. I spun around to see her shining her own light upward to the top of the barn. The window, I thought, and bolted to her side and looked up. It wasn't a bear. At first I thought it was one of my younger relatives pulling a prank on me, but when it opened its mouth and started to pant like a dog, I knew it was no prank. The creature was about 6 feet tall, at least 200 pounds. It was dark gray with a lighter shade around its neck. Its head was very similar to a German shepherd but with a much larger muzzle, and its eyes, the closest I can describe in color would be beer, but if someone had shown a dull yellow light through it, and those eyes were locked on us, mouth was still open, revealing sharp and jagged teeth, stained light brown. It was almost leaning out of the window, one hand resting on the side. Its hands resembled almost a raccoon's hands, with long bony fingers and sharp claws. My wife was about to scream again, but I shot my hand back and covered her mouth. She immediately grabbed my arm and clung to me. The creature put both hands on the window. I leaned down and whispered, "Run on 3, don't look back and hold the..." The creature jumped down and went to all 4s and growled. We bolted. The 25-yard gap between the house and the barn seemed to take minutes, But it was only 20 or 30 seconds. The dogs had all ran back to the deck and were all growling and baring teeth. My wife reached the door first and flung it open, turned and screamed. I glanced behind and saw that it was close, less than 10 feet. I reached the front steps and jumped as hard and as far as I could, and thankfully landed inside with the dogs right behind me. My wife slammed the door and was then thrown back as the door flung back open, the creature standing up now, baring teeth. But thankfully the door slammed back and was only slightly open. I saw the porch light through the crack and the door start to be blocked out, and quickly kicked it shut, sprung to my feet and put all my weight into it. I felt the creature slam into the door and heard the wood crack. My wife thankfully had recovered and rushed to my side to set the lock in place. We left the entryway, locking another door behind us, and ran into our kitchen. The only window was a small one above the sink which we hid under, hopefully out of sight. I luckily had a pistol in the kitchen, but it was in view of the window. We huddled there for 3 hours, all the while the creature was running along and banging on windows, walls, and the doors. Our each dog sat in different entryways to other rooms. They bared their teeth one at a time. They must have seen it in windows. A few times we saw a shadow on the floor in front of us from the kitchen window. Not too long after that we heard the horses whinny, followed by a loud crash. I figured that they broke down the gate to escape into the pasture. We felt relived until one of the dogs bared its teeth a moment later, and the assault on the house continued. It was midnight when things settled, and the dogs no longer bared their teeth. We went to the bedroom, shut all the curtains, and locked the door. We tried to sleep, but every little sound outside made me to jump, and my wife was worried about the horses. Finally, we managed to sleep at the crack of dawn, but only a few hours. When we awoke, we immediately went to check the horses. Thankfully, they were all fine, terrified but fine, and the only wounded one was my wife's mare. The morning sun revealed that the gash that the beast left had already stopped bleeding. We patched her up and started on repairing the barn door. But as it turns out, it didn't need repairs at all. We had used a heavy bolt to lock the horses in. It was undone and the latch was flipped. I realized that this thing had to be very intelligent. That day we went into the town. One stop to get a deadbolt for the barn, and another by the sporting goods store for a new gun. But ever since that night we had no more encounters, unless you count the horses refusing to leave the barn a few weeks later. I asked my nearby neighbors if anything strange happened on their property, and all but one had no problems. The one was a neighbor from a few miles south of my property. When I asked what happened, all he told me was that he lost a stallion a few weeks prior to my encounter. I asked him if he saw anything, and he gave me a funny look and said that he figured it was a roaming bear or a large pack of coyotes. I thought he was hiding something, but I didn't push any further. Since then, I can't look at the woods the same anymore. If these things are out there, who knows what else is? I don't feel safe going fishing, camping, or even horseback riding. I will say this, though. Watch your backs in the woods. My name is Elijah, and this happened to me in 2000. Let me state this clearly. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in conspiracy theories or monsters in the woods. I'm a fisherman. Been one my whole life. My old man taught me, and I passed it along to my boy, too. Nothing beats the calm of the lake at sunrise. Maybe that's why that year felt so jarring. I started finding things in the woods, weird things, animal carcasses. But not in ways anyone hunts or that any scavenger would leave them. It was that winter, I think. Yeah, had to be. Ice fishing's a whole different beast. Quiet and still on the frozen lake. That's the thing, that quiet. It's what makes what happened so damn impossible to forget. I drilled my hole, bait in the water. Just me and that smooth, wide expanse in every direction. I must have dozed off because something woke me up. Not a fish tugging, no bigger than that. Something was moving out there. I sat up straight, peered across the ice, saw nothing. Just the wind whistling that lonely tune. I chalked it up to nerves or cabin fever. But then it happened again. A flash of something, tall and dark, sipping between the trees on the shoreline. This wasn't a deer. Way too big, way too fast. Whatever it was watching me. Now I'm not ashamed to admit I was spooked. Packed up quick and went home. For weeks I couldn't go back. The image of that thing was etching to my mind. But eventually the eyes thawed and the fishing season started up in earnest. I couldn't stay away forever, bills gotta be paid. So back I went. Started in the familiar shallow parts of the lake, but those sightings, they changed something in me. I found myself edging my boat towards the deeper water, towards the thick patches of trees that lined the shore. Needed to figure out what or who was out there. First couple of trips turned up nothing. Started thinking I was crazy, that I'd imagined the whole thing. Then one afternoon out by the old sunken pier, I heard it, a growl. Low and guttural, not from any animal I recognized. My breath hitched. Slowly I turned the boat and there it was, standing between the pines, maybe 20 feet tall, if not more. Thick dark fur covered its whole body from its massive feet to its... Well, I couldn't make out a proper head in the gloom. But if those eyes were human-sized, the skull beneath the fur would have been enormous. The thing was still as a statue, just watching. No aggression, no hunger, just a chilling stillness. I sat frozen, half expecting it to lumber forward, snatched me and my boat right out of the water. But it didn't move. After what felt like forever, it turned and vanished back into the trees with a speed that defied its size. I started the engine and got the hell out of there. People don't believe me when I tell this story. Say it's just a bear, a big bear maybe. But bears don't stand on two legs. They don't melt into shadows like that. I've thought about going back, taking a camera, getting proof. Some days I even load up the gear, ready to confront the damn thing. But then I remember those eyes. They weren't animal, not fully. There was an intelligence in them, a calculating coldness that still makes my gut churn. I've heard stories, of course. But seeing that creature, it wasn't just some animal tale. It was something different, something older. And the question that keeps me up at night isn't what it was, but if it was the only one. The next few months were a blur. I'd go out always pushing myself further, searching. The fish didn't seem to matter so much anymore. Whatever that thing was, I felt drawn to the woods. That primal pull of the hunter. But also, I think, there was a part of me desperate for an explanation and answer anything. Sometimes I'd see tracks, massive footprints sunk into the mud or pressed faintly into the snow. I tried setting up trail cams, but they were either smashed or mysteriously never seemed to capture anything at all. And once, while sitting in my deer blind, I heard something crashing through the brush, the sound of branches snapping. My heart pounded in my chest, but I knew there was no way I could face whatever was making that noise. Not alone. So I didn't. Instead, I got the hell out of Dodge and called the park rangers. Told them about some bear activity, feeling stupid for not reporting it sooner. Naturally, they found nothing, and I was left alone. Brushed it off like they probably do about 100 other reports each year. Maybe they thought I was just some kook who had been out in the woods too long. I didn't blame him. I still saw it a few more times. A silhouette against a full moon or a flash of movement on the tree line. Sometimes I felt its presence even when it wasn't visible, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. The sighting stopped. That winter everything went eerily quiet, not even the tracks anymore. I don't know if it left or if it's still lurking out there, watching, waiting. Maybe that's why I keep going back to those woods. Not just for the fish, but for that elusive sense of closure, the chance to finally see the damn thing up close and know what it actually is. The other day I was out on the lake, fog thick as pea soup. I could barely see the end of my fishing rod. Just me, the stillness, and the thought that maybe something else was lurking beneath the surface, or hidden in the swirling mist. It wasn't the monster I was afraid of. It was the fact I knew it could be out there, and I might never see it coming. Sometimes, late at night, I still find myself staring into the darkness, the wind rattling the window pane. Sometimes I swear I can see those eyes flickering at the edge of the tree line. Maybe it's just my imagination playing tricks. Or maybe, just maybe, that thing knows I'm still here, still waiting, still watching. One day I'll go back to the woods. I'll bring my rifle this time. Maybe my son too if I can convince him. One way or another, I need to find out what's lurking out there. I'm not sure if I want to kill it or even find proof it exists. But something's got to give, you know? This weight, this unease, it can only wear you down for so long. I spent the week with a buddy, Arlo, at his hunting cabin out in the Texas hill country. Remote's an understatement with barely a neighbor in sight. You know, the kind of place where a guy can unwind, knock back a couple beers, and stare down the sunset from the porch with zero distractions. Arlo loves to hunt. I mean, the guy's got a full taxidermy room with so many heads and antlers mounted, it looks like some kind of woodland cult meeting place. Personally, I'm no big outdoorsman, but chilling at a cabin with no worries for a few days, yeah, that's my speed. So the first couple days were pretty much exactly what I hoped for. We cooked steaks on the grill, watched some football, and just enjoyed the peace and quiet. But on the third day, things took a turn. We were out back splitting wood, prepping for our nightly fire and bourbon ritual, when we heard rustling. Now there's wildlife in the area, sure, but something about this sound felt different. Arlo froze mid-swing. "Did you hear that?" he asked, voice low. "Yeah," I said, glancing around for any sign of what it might be. The woods were dense and dark beyond the cleared area. The rustling came again, a snapping of twigs and movement through brush. I saw Arlo ease his hand towards the hunting rifle propped up against the cabin. "Coyotes probably," I said, trying to brush it off. I wasn't exactly a Rambo, more like an IT guy lost in the woods. Arlo nodded slowly, still scanning the trees. Just then we heard a low, guttural growl. It froze me to the bone. That was way too big to be a coyote. "Get inside," Arlo whispered urgently. We moved fast, eyes darting towards the tree line. Slamming the door behind us, Arlo grabbed the rifle. "What the hell do you think that was?" I asked, heart pounding. He shrugged, peering out the small windows. "I don't know, Miles. Not seen nothing like that around here before." For hours, everything was eerily still. But as dusk fell, that sense of unease prickled the back of my neck. I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. We kept the lights low and our voices to whispers. We both knew there was something big out there in the dark. Then, just when I thought I couldn't get any more creeped out, we heard movement on the roof. Something heavy, claws scratching across the shingles. It paced back and forth above us, like it was deciding whether to come down and make us an evening snack. "Arlo," I started, but he just held up a hand to quiet me. He slowly chambered around in the rifle, the sound echoing in the silent cabin. We waited. Minutes felt like hours. We heard the scratching, growling, shifting like it was searching. Arlo moved towards the window, overlooking the front porch, slowly lifting the corner of the blind. "Oh, crap," he breathed. "Miles, you better come see this." I edged closer, stomach twisting. Through the gap, bathed in the porch light's glow, stood a creature straight out of a nightmare. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall on its hind legs. Its body was a grotesque mix of man and wolf coarse fur, elongated muzzle and claws longer than my fingers. I felt bile rising in my throat. "What the hell is that thing?" I hissed. "I don't know, man. Some kind of hybrid. I ain't never seen nothing like it." The creature stood stock still, its gaze locked on the cabin door. It was like it could smell our fear. It let out another guttural growl, and a string of drool dripped from its fangs. We stayed frozen, hardly daring to breathe. It moved suddenly, disappearing out of view, its heavy footsteps pounding across the porch. Arlo and I exchanged wide-eyed looks. We knew it was circling the cabin, hunting for a way in. "Think, Miles, think," Arlo said, his usual confident swagger gone. "Where's the weakest point? Any windows?" I frantically scanned the room. Our best shot was to barricade the door and hope whatever that monster was, it couldn't break through. "The living room window," I rasped. "It's got those old iron bars it might hold." While Arlo piled furniture against the door, I raced to the window, heart thrumming. The bars were rusty but seemed fairly solid. I started reinforcing them with anything I could find. Logs, Arlo's toolbox, even one of the taxidermied animal heads looked like a weapon in my trembling hands. Outside, we heard branches snapping as if the creature was getting closer. Every creak, every thud sent shivers down my spine. We finished the final barricade just as a shadow fell across the window. A monstrous clawed hand slammed against the glass, the force rippling through the old. The creature's roar made the entire cabin shake. I held my breath, waiting for the window to explode inward. The creature backed up, ramming its shoulder into the wood frame. I screamed, bracing myself against the wall. The window warped, but miraculously held. It snarled, snapping those monstrous teeth, then prowled away into the darkness. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. This was far from over. The night was young, and that thing wasn't giving up anytime soon. Arlo and I hunkered down, taking turns keeping watch. The creature came back several times, each attempt to batter its way, and making my heart hammer like a frantic drumbeat. I was exhausted, terrified, and running out of nervous jokes. I just wanted to make it until sunrise. We had a brief respite of silence that lulled me into a fitful half-sleep, but I jerked awake at the sound of breaking glass. Arlo sat bolt upright, a single word escaping his lips. We scrambled to our feet, adrenaline spiking. The sounds were clear now. The snarls, that horrid scrabbling of claws on tile. It was inside. Arlo and I exchanged a terror-filled look. Whatever this creature was, it had outsmarted us. "We've got to move," Arlo hissed, grabbing his rifle. "Stay low, stay behind me." I nodded, my throat thick with fear. Every muscle in my body felt like it was about to snap. Every noise made my skin crawl. This thing was a ruthless predator playing a sick game with us. It was toying with its prey. Holding our breaths, we crept towards the back room. It was small, cramped, with only one small window high on the wall. Escape seemed impossible, but it was our only shot. Arlo boosted me towards the window, desperation fueling his strength. I reached up, scrambling for a grip on the rusted iron bars. They were high, but smaller than the others, maybe with a burst of adrenaline. I hoisted myself up, digging my toes into the cracking brick. "Arlo, hurry," I whispered, frantically trying to wrench a bar loose. The room was too dark to see properly, but I could hear the creature below, the shattering of the kitchen door as it tore through the flimsy structure. A crash made me jump, then a guttural snarl directly below me. Arlo appeared at the window, scrambling up beside me. His face was etched in grim determination. He jammed the rifle barrel through the bars, firing blindly down into the darkness. The creature unleashed a furious bellow, the sound vibrating through the floorboards and rattling the window. I was shaking so hard I thought I'd lose my grip. "Miles, get that bar off, now!" Arlo yelled, shoving more of his gun through the gap. I clawed at the rusty metal, my nails tearing, blood welled up on my fingers, my breath coming in frantic gasps. Suddenly there was a jolt, and one bar ripped loose. "Let's go," Arlo shouted, hauling himself out the small opening. My heart pounded like a war drum as I squeezed myself through, the jagged edge cutting my arm, but I hardly felt it. We landed awkwardly on the other side, tumbling into the long grass. I scrambled up, Arlo close behind. In the distance we saw a flicker of movement as the creature emerged from the cabin. The moonlight glinted off its massive claws. It paused, sniffing the air, and then emitted a howl that made my blood freeze. We ran blindly through the woods, the howls getting louder. The creature was on the hunt. We stumbled through the undergrowth, branches whipping at our faces. I couldn't see where I was going, could only hear that horrifying snarl behind us. I tripped, falling hard. Pain shot up my leg as I slammed into something unseen, a rock, a tree root. Arlo hauled me to my feet, half dragging me as we staggered onwards. We emerged breathlessly into a small clearing, up ahead a flicker of light, the highway. Maybe if we made it there, someone would be driving by, a patrol car, any car. We sprinted towards the road, hope flaring desperately in my chest. Then it shot out of the shadows, a monstrous blur of fangs and claws. It tackled Arlo, sending him flying. I screamed his name, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I watched in horror as the creature sank its teeth into him, tearing and thrashing with unnatural strength. "Run, Miles, run!" Arlo choked out, blood bubbling at his lips. A shot rang out, the creature flinching. Arlo was firing, even amidst the brutal attack. Then I did something I thought I'd never do. I turned and ran. Some part of me knew it was cowardice, but it was also survival. I sprinted for the road, tears blurring my vision. Arlo's screams echoing in my ears. Reaching the asphalt, I turned back for a heart-stopping second. The creature was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. Arlo was, too. I stumbled down the highway, collapsing in the middle of the empty road. I screamed and screamed until the echoes faded into empty silence, then lay there, spent and broken, until the first fingers of dawn painted the sky. They found me hours later, a deputy and state trooper looking wide-eyed and bewildered. My hysterical claims of a monster in the woods earned me a hospital stay and more than a few skeptical glances. Nobody found a trace of Arlo or anything that matched the creature I described. Maybe they thought I was just plain crazy, traumatized by something normal that took my friend and sent my imagination spinning into overdrive. But deep down, I know what I saw out there that night. I know it's still out there. I never went back to the cabin. I couldn't bear it. I heard rumblings about wild animal attacks in the area for a while. Unexplained disappearances. Things shrugged off as coyote or mountain lion territory. But I know what it really is. Even years later, sometimes I'll swear I'll catch a glimpse of something monstrous watching me from the shadows. A pair of glittering eyes, a flash of claws. I call it the Shrikeheart, that name echoing in my nightmares. My name is Guillermo Andres Reyes, and I'm 34 years old. And this happened to me in the fall of 2011. Wife still teases me how that backpacking trip was a little wilder than I'd promised. Thing is, she isn't wrong. I work off the books for the government, a specialized kind of wildlife control unit. Mostly it's dealing with the rumors the internet cooks up. Mutant fish, rabid bears, the usual. But every so often you get a call that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. This time it was the Ozarks. Locals muttering about missing livestock, campers disappearing. Nothing solid to go on. Half-whispered stories passed around campfires about shadows in the woods, glowing eyes. Team was me, Flynn, and Walsh. Flynn, ex-Marine, the stoic type with a mean right hook. Walsh, our wildlife expert. Quiet, but could identify scat a mile off. Me? Let's just say I'd seen things that made the average bear attack look like a walk in the park. The Ozarks are old, rugged, the kind of place that feels like it's got secrets buried under centuries of leaves. First day was recon, talking to folks. Standard procedure, get a feel for the lay of the land and sift truth from tall tale. One old-timer, farmer who claimed he'd been in these hills his whole life, finally gave us something halfway concrete. A cave system a few ridges over, history of strange happenings even before the disappearances. Said it was a bad place, told us to leave well enough alone. We had our target. Next morning we geared up and hiked out. Flynn checked the GPS tracker. Looks like about 3 miles through the woods. Walsh pointed to some old tracks near the trail. Whatever made those isn't anything I'm familiar with. Claws, big ones. I exchanged a look with Flynn. Not what we wanted to find. The trees thinned as we got closer. Sun barely sliced through the canopy, giving the forest a dim, watchful feel. We switched to hand signals now. Flynn took point. Walsh brought up the rear, a tranquilizer rifle at the ready. The cave came into view, a jagged maw in the hillside. Thick, choking smell hung in the air, old blood and something rancor. Walsh swore softly and held up a fist. We went to ground, scanning the area. Something was wrong, too quiet. Even the birds had stopped chirping. Flynn motioned for us to circle around, get a better angle. Then I saw it. The thing was hunched just inside the cave. A dark silhouette against the brighter light beyond. Massive, at least 8 feet tall at the shoulder, even crouched. Its fur hung in patches, showing raw skin with what looked pustules or boils. But its head, that was what burned into my memory. Long wolf-like snout stretched too far, and teeth, a ragged mess of bone jutting at all angles. It lifted its head, sniffing the air. 2 eyes flashed open, not animal eyes, a wrong yellow, slit-pupiled and filled with a terrible intelligence. It saw us. Too late. The creature lunged from the cave in a blur of motion. It knocked Walsh aside like a rag doll, the rifle flying. Thing was fast, impossibly so for its size. Flynn opened fire with his automatic, bullets tearing into its shoulder. No reaction. It grabbed at Flynn, who roared and threw up an arm to block. Claws ripped through his Kevlar vest, tossing him back. I drew my own pistol, firing as I charged forward. Aiming for anything vital was useless. It moved too damn fast. All I could do was distract it. Flynn scrambled back, swearing. He was bleeding badly, arm hanging wrong. I fired again and the creature turned, eyes fixing on me. It let out a hissing snarl and the stench washed over me, nearly making me gag. Walsh was yelling something, but all I could focus on was that gaping maw and the rank, rotten smell of it. So much blood, those teeth. The gunshot cracked through my stunned haze. Walsh, lying sprawled but rifle steady, had managed a clean shot right through one of its eyes. The creature roared, the sound echoing through the trees, and staggered back. "Into the cave!" Walsh shouted. I blinked, finding my voice. "Flynn!" We hauled Flynn up, half stumbling, half dragging him towards the cave. Thing was thrashing around, wounded but far from done. We needed cover, needed to regroup. We lunged into the blessed darkness of the cave. Flynn groaned, each ragged breath sending a fresh spike of pain through him. The creature was howling outside, a terrifying soundtrack to our desperate scramble. "We gotta go deeper," Walsh gasped, flashlight beam bouncing wildly over rough cavern walls. I fumbled for my own light. Flynn slumped against a rock, face white, legs busted. "I ain't going nowhere." Despair clawed at me. Flynn down, cave a dead end. We were trapped. I started reloading my pistol, hands shaking. The howling cut off abruptly. In the silence that followed, we could hear it snuffling outside the cave entrance. It knew we were in here. It was waiting. Walsh swore. He was right. No backup coming out here. No miracle escape. That's the thing about this job. The part they never explain at orientation. Sometimes the boogeyman is real, and sometimes you're just the next course on the menu. "Give me the rifle," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You two get deeper in, find somewhere to hide. Like hell." Flynn growled, gritting his teeth as he tried to staunch the blood flow from his shredded arm. "I ain't leaving you as monster chow." Walsh hesitated, that familiar torn look on his face. The biologist wanting to run, the man knowing it was pointless. The thing outside let out a low, guttural growl. It was coming in. "Go," I said, shoving the rifle into Walsh's hands. "I'll give you some time." They argued, of course. But fear's a good motivator, and seconds later the beams of their flashlights were bobbing away into the depths of the cave. I crouched near the entrance, raised my gun, and took a steadying breath. This was it. One final stand, a last desperate act of defiance against the impossible. The first shadows flickered at the cave mouth. The creature squeezed inside, its mangled eye milky in the gloom. The other glowed, fixing on me. It stalked forward. I fired, once, twice, aiming for the center of its hulking form. The bullet stung it, drew roars of fury, but the damn thing kept coming. It lunged. I barely dodged, rolling aside as the claws raked the air where I'd just been. Scrambling back, I fired again. My shots connected, but they were mosquito bites to this beast. It roared and charged again. This time I wasn't fast enough. A searing pain ripped through my side as a claw caught me. I slammed against the cave wall, my gun flying from my grasp. Vision blurring, I saw the creature loom over me, its maw opening, teeth dripping. Then a different kind of roar echoed through the cave. A blinding flash of light, the smell of burning fur. The creature recoiled, screeching, its good eye wide with confusion. Walsh, the tranquilizer rifle. He'd come back. My vision swam. Flynn's battered form was pulling himself up beside Walsh, his one good arm wrapped around something. A grenade? The creature, enraged and disoriented, stumbled forward. Flynn swore and hurled the grenade at its feet. I couldn't look away, some part of me already knowing how this would end. The explosion was deafening. Rock crumbled, dust choked the air. When I could see again, half the cave had collapsed. The creature was gone, crushed or buried, I couldn't tell. And Flynn? Well, let's just say I don't remember much after that. They found us eventually. Special Forces or some Black Ops unit. All hard faces and efficient questions. Extracted us, patched us up. But there was no celebration, no relieved handshakes. I got the standard debriefing, the thinly veiled threats. National security, they droned. You understand, I get it. Can't have monsters running around in the news creating panic. Easier to cover it up. Dismiss us as delusional. Walsh quit soon after, said he had enough of things lurking in the shadows. I couldn't blame him. Some days I get the same itch to walk away, build a normal life somewhere far from any damn woods. But then I remember Flynn. The way he looked at me right before he pulled that pin. There's a price for the truth, a cost that most people never have to pay. My wife thinks I came back from the Ozarks a different man. She's not wrong. Thing is, sometimes the monsters aren't the ones with claws. Sometimes they wear suits, give orders, and bury the evidence. And they're the ones we're left to fight. I remember it really clearly. It was about 20 years ago, back when we lived in Washington. My wife was never the outdoorsy type, so when my son Brandon wanted to go camping, it was always just me and him. That wasn't bad, though. It was good father-son time. As I sit here now looking back on those days, I can't help but feel a mix of nostalgia and unease. The events of that particular camping trip have haunted me for 2 decades, and I'm still not sure I understand what really happened. But let me start at the beginning. It was a crisp autumn morning when Brandon and I set out for our camping adventure. The air was filled with the scent of pine and the promise of adventure. I had taken a rare day off from work, determined to make the most of this time with my son. As we loaded up the car with our gear, I couldn't help but notice how much Brandon had grown. At 9 years old, he was already showing signs of the man he would become, and it filled me with both pride and a twinge of sadness at how quickly time was passing. The drive to the campsite was scenic, winding through the lush Washington forests. I remember Brandon asked me about the music on the radio, and I spent an embarrassingly long time reminiscing about my high school days and what bands I was obsessed with back then. It was one of those perfect moments of connection between father and son, the kind I wished I had more often. "Dad, did you really have long hair like that?" Brandon asked, pointing to a picture of an 80s rock band on the radio display. I laughed, running a hand through my now much shorter and slightly graying hair. "Oh yeah, I thought I was so cool. Your mom hated it, though. She's the reason I cut it all off." Brandon giggled, trying to imagine his straight-laced father as a long-haired rocker. It was moments like these that made me realize how much I had changed, how much responsibility had shaped me into the man I was now. As we drove, I couldn't help but reflect on my relationship with Brandon. Work had been demanding more and more of my time lately, and I felt a constant undercurrent of guilt for not being around as much as I should be. This camping trip was my attempt to make up for lost time, to strengthen the bond between us before it was too late. Eventually, we reached our campsite, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering evergreens. I got to work pitching our tent while Brandon waited patiently. He wasn't the type to go running off or anything, which I appreciated. It reminded me of myself at his age, always eager to help, always trying to be responsible. "Want to give me a hand with these tent poles, champ?" I called out. Brandon jumped up, eager to assist. "Sure, Dad, what do I do?" I showed him how to connect the poles and thread them through the fabric of the tent. It was a simple task, but the look of concentration on his face as he worked made my heart swell with pride. This was what fatherhood was all about, these small moments of teaching and togetherness. Once the tent was set up, Brandon and I decided to go for a hike to take in the nature around us. The woods surrounding the campground were calm and serene. There weren't any animals out and about, but every once in a while I would stop and point out a deer track or some droppings. "See those, Brandon?" I said, crouching down to examine a set of prints in the soft earth. "Those are deer tracks. You can tell by the shape. See how it looks like a heart?" Brandon leaned in, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Cool. Do you think we'll see any deer?" "Maybe if we're quiet and patient," I replied, lowering my voice to a whisper. "Animals are always around us in the forest, but they're good at hiding." As we walked, I couldn't help but be reminded of my own childhood camping trips with my father. I was about Brandon's age when I learned about the marvels of deer poop myself. It was strange how life seemed to come full circle, with me now playing the role of the knowledgeable dad. Looking at Brandon, I couldn't help but see a younger version of myself. We had the same eyes, the same hair, and like most of the people in my family, we had the same birthmark on our upper right arm. It was a small, irregularly shaped patch of darker skin, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. But to me, it was a sign of our connection, a visible reminder of the blood we shared. As we hiked, I found myself opening up to Brandon more than I usually did. Maybe it was the peaceful surroundings, or maybe it was the guilt I felt for not spending enough time with him, but words seemed to flow more easily between us. "You know, Brandon," I said as we paused to catch our breath, "I'm really glad we're doing this. I know I've been working a lot lately, and I'm sorry if it feels like I'm not around as much as I should be." Brandon looked up at me, his expression serious beyond his years. "It's okay, Dad. I know you're working hard for us." His maturity caught me off guard, and I felt a lump form in my throat. "That's right. but it doesn't make it any easier to miss out on time with you and your mom. I want you to know that you can always talk to me about anything, okay?" Brandon nodded, and I ruffled his hair affectionately. We continued our hike, the conversation drifting to lighter topics: school, his friends, the latest video game he was obsessed with. It was hard spending time with Brandon sometimes, knowing how much I was missing out on, but seeing him smile and laugh that day really uplifted my spirits. I was here now, and that's what mattered, is what I'd tell myself whenever the conversation lulled. As we were walking, we suddenly found the trail leading out of the woods and into a beautiful view of the river. The water rushed by, a constant soothing sound that seemed to wash away some of the stress I'd been carrying. I was telling Brandon about erosion, and how you could see the effects of the previous year's floods on the riverbank when his expression suddenly changed. He pointed up to the sky and said, "What's that, Dad?" I looked up myself and found that I was just as confused as he was. There, off in the distance, was a dark, triangular-looking object. It hung in the sky perfectly still, defying all logic and everything I knew about aircraft. Then, as suddenly as we had noticed it, it vanished. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Not wanting to lose my reputation as a know-it-all dad, I desperately searched for an answer before deciding that it must have been a helicopter and telling Brandon as such. He obviously didn't believe me, and frankly, I didn't believe myself either. "But Dad," Brandon protested, "helicopters don't look like that, and they don't just disappear." I put a hand on his shoulder, trying to appear more confident than I felt. Sometimes the light can play tricks on our eyes, especially at this time of day. It was probably just farther away than we thought, and it went behind a cloud. Brandon didn't seem convinced, but he didn't argue further. As for me, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. What had we just seen? The rational part of my brain insisted it must have a logical explanation, but a smaller, more primitive part whispered that something wasn't right. By the time we got back to our tent, the sun had already started to set. I got Brandon to help me collect some firewood and start up a fire. The physical activity helped distract me from the strange sighting earlier, and soon we were both caught up in the simple pleasures of camping. We roasted some hot dogs and marshmallows over the crackling fire. The smell of wood smoke and the warmth of the flames created a cozy atmosphere, and I found myself relaxing despite the earlier unease. "This is the best part of camping," Brandon declared, his face sticky with melted marshmallow. I laughed, tossing another log onto the fire. "You're right about that. Nothing beats a good campfire." As the night grew darker, I had planned to tell some scary stories. It was a camping tradition, after all. But as I looked at Brandon, I could see his eyelids growing heavy. He was fighting to stay awake, determined not to miss out on any part of our adventure, but it was clear he was exhausted from our day of hiking and fresh air. "I think it's time for bed, buddy," I said gently. "We've got another big day tomorrow." Brandon started to protest but was interrupted by a massive yawn. Chuckling, I helped him into the tent and got him settled into his sleeping bag. As I crawled into my own right beside him, I couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. Despite my worries about not being present enough in Brandon's life, days like this reminded me of the strong bond we shared. "Good night, Dad," Brandon mumbled, already half asleep. "Good night, son," I replied softly, listening as his breathing evened out into the deep rhythms of sleep. As I lay there in the darkness, my mind wandered back to the strange object we had seen in the sky. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was nothing out of the ordinary, but something about it nagged at me. Eventually, lulled by the sounds of the forest and Brandon's steady breathing, I drifted off to sleep. It was the shaking that woke me at first. I had been in an earthquake before, but this was different. It was hard to describe. It was almost like someone was picking up the earth and the earth was trying to pull it back. I was still groggy, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. Instinctively, I reached out to see if Brandon was awake, but I found his sleeping bag empty. For a moment, I wasn't too panicked. Like I said, he wasn't the type to run off, and I always try to keep a level head. Maybe he had just gone to use the bathroom, I told myself. I stumbled out of the tent and walked towards where the flashlights were, confident that I would find him near the fire, maybe trying to cope with the shaking. Then the lights happened. The whole campground was bathed in a bright, sickly white light. It was blinding at first, and when my vision adjusted, I realized that Brandon was nowhere to be found. That was when I started to panic. My heart racing, I grabbed a flashlight and started shouting his name. "Brandon! Brandon, where are you?" My voice echoed through the trees, but there was no response. As I ran to the edge of the woods surrounding the campsite, I tried looking for a source for the light, but I couldn't see one. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, an unnatural glow that made the familiar campsite seem alien and threatening. Just as I was about to plunge into the dark woods, my pounding heart skipped a beat when I heard Brandon's voice. He called out to me, "Dad, I'm over here!" Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. His next words sent a chill down my spine. "Help, something's wrong." I ran to the other side of the campsite and found him crouched away from me in a little ditch. The shaking had mostly subsided, but the eerie light still bathed everything in its sickly glow. Brandon was facing away from the light, and I rushed over to him, my paternal instincts overriding any fear or confusion I felt. I put my hand on his back, trying to comfort him. "What's the matter? Are you hurt?" I could hear him struggling for air, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Dad," he finally cried, his voice weak and trembling. "Something's wrong. Everything's wrong." I reached for his hand, wanting to pull him close and protect him from whatever was causing him such distress. But when I touched it, alarm bells rang in my head. His skin felt wrong. It was rubbery and wrinkly, like a Halloween mask left out in the sun too long. With shaking hands, I turned my flashlight on him, and what I saw made my blood run cold. His whole skin looked a horrid purple, like a bruise spread over his entire body. "Brandon," I muttered in shock, my voice barely above a whisper. Steeling myself, I gently turned him to face me, and I couldn't hold back a scream of horror. His face was emaciated, his eyes so sunken they looked like a skull's empty sockets. His jaw hung open like the muscles that held it were worn and worthless. This couldn't be my son, my mind screamed. This couldn't be real. My whole body shook in terror, mirroring the violent tremors that had woken me earlier. It seemed as if the ground was going to get ripped up and thrown into the sky. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get away from this nightmare. But I couldn't leave my son. Whatever was happening to him, whatever this was, I had to help him. I grabbed Brandon and held him as close to me as I could. I found myself praying to a God I was never sure actually existed, begging for this to be a dream, for my son to be okay. Through gurgles and moans, Brandon started to talk, his voice a horrifying parody of the cheerful boy I knew. "It hurts, Dad. Why does it hurt so much? Help me, Dad." As I squeezed him, I could feel him get thinner and thinner, like his insides were being sucked out. It felt like there was nothing left of him but a hollow shell. Tears started rolling down my face, and the last thing I heard him say, faint as a whisper, haunted me. "Why won't you help me, Dad?" I wanted to scream, to tell him I was trying, that I didn't know how to help him. But before I could say anything, everything went black. A nudge caused me to bolt upright in my sleeping bag. My heart was racing, my body covered in a cold sweat. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. Then I heard Brandon's voice, normal and cheerful. "Wake up, Dad, I'm hungry." I stared at him, uncomprehending. He looked perfectly fine. No purple skin, no sunken eyes, just my normal, healthy son. As my heart rate slowly returned to normal and I came back to reality, I realized that I had just had a crazy nightmare. I chuckled to myself, relief washing over me in waves. "Sure thing, buddy," I managed to say, my voice still shaky. "Let's get some breakfast going." As I prepared our meal, I kept glancing at Brandon, reassuring myself that he was okay. He chatted away happily about the day ahead, completely unaware of the terror I had just experienced. I tried to shake off the lingering unease, telling myself it was just a dream, probably triggered by the strange object we had seen in the sky the day before. After Brandon was fed, I found myself drawn to the ditch from my nightmare. I walked over, half expecting to see, I don't know what, but there was nothing weird or out of the ordinary. It was just a small depression in the ground, probably formed by rainfall. Brandon seemed just like he always was, and didn't mention anything about the previous night. When I casually asked if he had felt the ground shake, he looked at me quizzically and said he hadn't felt a thing. We spent the rest of the day hiking, fishing, and enjoying nature. By the time we packed up to head home, the nightmare had faded to a distant, unsettling memory. I was able to convince myself that it was nothing more than a vivid dream, a product of an overactive imagination and too many campfire stories over the years. When we got back to civilization, I found myself asking other people if they had felt any tremors or seen any strange lights. They all agreed with Brandon. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened that night. I began to feel a bit foolish for even asking, and I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. For a week then, my mind was at ease. I threw myself back into work, the camping trip becoming a pleasant memory of time spent with my son. When I finally had a day off, my wife suggested we take Brandon to the pool. It was a hot day, and the idea of cooling off in the water sounded perfect. As we arrived at the pool and started to set up our things, Brandon eagerly pulled off his t-shirt, ready to jump into the water. It was then that memories of that night came flooding back, along with a fresh wave of horror. I looked at Brandon's arm, the place where our family birthmark had always been. A small, distinctive patch of darker skin on the upper right arm. But it was gone. The skin was smooth and unmarked, as if the birthmark had never existed. "Brandon," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "what happened to your birthmark?" He looked at his arm, then back at me, confusion clear on his face. "What birthmark, Dad? I've never had a birthmark." I felt the world tilt around me. How could this be? The birthmark had been there his entire life. I had seen it just a week ago on our camping trip. I looked at my wife, hoping for some confirmation, but she just gave me a concerned look. "Honey, are you feeling all right?" she asked, placing a hand on my arm. "Brandon's never had a birthmark. Are you thinking of someone else?" I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. No, I'm sure he had one. Just like mine, remember? I rolled up my sleeve to show her, but to my shock, my own birthmark was gone as well. The skin on my upper right arm was as smooth and unmarked as Brandon's. My wife's concern deepened. "Sweetie, you've never had a birthmark either. Maybe you should sit down for a bit. The heat might be getting to you." I sat on a nearby lounger, my mind reeling. How could this be happening? Was I losing my mind? I watched as Brandon jumped into the pool, laughing and splashing without a care in the world. He seemed perfectly normal, perfectly happy. But something was very, very wrong. Over the next few weeks, I found myself obsessing over the missing birthmarks and the events of that camping trip. I scoured our family photos, looking for evidence of the birthmarks I was sure we both had. But in every picture, our arms were unmarked. I even called my parents and siblings, casually asking about family birthmarks, but they all looked at me like I was crazy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, but the world had shifted somehow during that night in the woods. The memory of Brandon's transformation in my dream haunted me. What if it wasn't a dream at all? What if something had happened to us, something beyond my understanding? I started researching, spending late nights on the internet looking into strange phenomena, UFO sightings, and unexplained events. I found countless stories of people who claimed to have experienced lost time or inexplicable changes after encounters with strange lights or objects. Some of them sounded eerily similar to what we had seen that day by the river. As the months passed, I noticed other small changes. Brandon's favorite color, which had always been blue, was now red. He had suddenly developed an allergy to peanuts, which he'd never had before. These could be explained away as a child's changing preferences or a late-onset allergy, but to me they were further evidence that something was not right. My wife began to worry about my behavior. She caught me comparing old and new photos of Brandon, looking for any differences. She found the books on paranormal phenomena I had hidden in my office. Finally, she confronted me. "You need to talk to someone," she insisted. "This obsession isn't healthy. Brandon is fine. Nothing happened on that camping trip." But how could I explain to her what I was feeling? How could I make her understand that our son might not be the same boy who went into those woods? In the end, I agreed to see a therapist, if only to appease her. The therapist listened patiently as I poured out my story. She suggested that the stress of work and my guilt over not spending enough time with my family might have manifested in this elaborate delusion. She recommended medication and more sessions, but I left her office feeling more alone than ever. Years passed, and life went on. Brandon grew into a teenager, then a young man. He was happy, successful, everything a parent could hope for. But every time I looked at him, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The memory of that night in the woods never faded, remaining as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. I learned to keep my doubts to myself, to smile and nod when people talked about Brandon's childhood or our family history. But late at night, when the house was quiet, I would often find myself staring at old family photos, trying to reconcile the boy in the pictures with the young man my son had become. Was it possible that I had imagined it all? That the stress and guilt of being an absent father had caused me to create this elaborate fantasy? Or had something truly inexplicable happened that night? Something that had changed not just Brandon, but the very fabric of our reality? I may never know the truth. The Brandon I have now is a wonderful son, and I love him dearly. But there's always a part of me that wonders about the boy I took camping all those years ago. The boy with the birthmark on his arm and a fear of peanuts. Sometimes I think I catch a glimpse of him in my son's eyes, like a ghost of a memory. And in those moments I'm torn between the joy of having my son and the unshakable feeling that something precious was lost that night in the woods. As I sit here now, an old man looking back on a life filled with love, success, and family, I still can't shake the events of that camping trip. They've colored every moment of my life since then, a constant reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. I've come to accept that I may never know what really happened that night, whether it was all in my mind or something truly supernatural. But I've learned to live with the uncertainty, to cherish the son I have while honoring the memory of the boy I remember. And sometimes when the night is quiet and the stars are bright, I find myself looking up at the sky, wondering if somewhere out there, in some parallel universe, another version of me is camping with another version of Brandon, both of them blissfully unaware of the strange life-altering events that could be waiting for them in the woods. This happened to me a couple of years ago. At the time, I was in desperate need of some fresh air. City slicker like me always fantasizes about some quiet, out-in-the-middle-of-nowhere peace. I'm alien, by the way. Software developer the quiet, keep-to-myself type. Figured a few days of solo exploration was precisely what I needed. That weekend, I packed my camping gear into my rusty old 4WD. The drive to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest was uneventful hours of winding highways through dense woodland, getting further and further from civilization. Finally, I spotted the dirt track to a small trailhead campsite. A weathered sign warned about bear activity, but the isolation was the whole point. My campsite was at the far end, just me. Some gnawed pine trees and an ancient fire pit. Perfection. That first night, something out happened. I'd never been alone out in the wilderness like that before. Every twig snap, every rustle of leaves set my mind racing. It felt like something was watching. I brushed it off nerves, right? I brought a book, so I huddled up by the fire to distract myself, but as the light began to fade, it began. It started slow, almost rhythmic, like a pebble gently tapped against stone. At first I figured it had to be my imagination. The next morning it became apparent it wasn't my mind playing tricks. I found 3 stones laid out in a neat triangle near my tent. My blood ran cold, but logic tried to reassert itself. Could be some other camper marking the path. Seemed like an idiotic thing to do in a place meant to feel remote. Still, I packed up my stuff quick just in case. As I went for a hike deeper into the woods, the sound followed. That same persistent beat against stone, just out of sight. At this point, a part of me knew someone was messing with me, trying to scare me away maybe. Then it hit me. Those stones by my tent weren't marking anything. They were a message. It was a game of what even? Was this some screwed-up initiation ritual? I'd read enough news to know there's weird folk hiding out in the sticks. Now, most folks would say turning back there was the smart thing to do. But you gotta understand, even when the fear sets in, I'm stubborn. The woods felt wrong. but I decided to see this through. Figured a good look around for signs of someone living out here would bring peace of mind. By late afternoon, my hunch started to seem less like the stuff of conspiracy theories, a hidden lean-to built under a moss-covered fallen tree, than a crude snare near a barely visible game trail. I tried not to imagine what or who it was for. Fear had settled heavy in my chest by now, but I just didn't want to leave with these unanswered questions. I needed to be sure. I rounded another dense stretch of forest expecting to stumble upon more evidence. No snare, no sign of further human interference. What I did find was, well, that's where the nightmares start. A clearing with a large fire pit. Except something seemed off about those charred rocks ringing it. It took a moment for it to register. Those weren't stones at all. Bones. Human bones, the shapes distorted with fire. Some looked cracked, like something had gnawed on them. I took a few panic steps back, the tapping sound almost deafening now. Bile was rising in my throat, and right then I saw him. A gaunt figure emerged from the darkness behind the skeletal fire pit. Tall, hunched over, skin stretched tight over ribs like something half-starved had finally found its dinner. It wore what looked like ragged patchwork furs, stained in places with dried blood. Its face wasn't quite right. Not the face of a normal man. The mouth seemed too wide, stretched into an ugly grin that exposed needle-like teeth. It just stood there, silently watching me. This creature tilted its head slightly, like it was puzzled by my presence, and then it charged. With an animalistic speed I didn't think possible, it was on top of me in seconds. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by a sickening crunch. And that's the last clear image in my mind. I woke up in a hospital bed 2 days later, a park ranger sitting stoically beside me. I had multiple gashes, 2 cracked ribs. One I had to be patched up. They never managed to explain what caused the bruising near my skull. No trace of anyone else was ever found in the woods. I insisted on my story about that thing, but of course, they put it down to hallucinations brought on by shock and sleep deprivation. To everyone else, it's an unexplained accident. I know something happened out there, though, not because of the scars, but because I hear it sometimes, even here in the city. In quiet moments, that damned rhythmic tapping starts up in the back of my mind. They never found those gnawed bones either. Whatever stalks the Gifford Pinchot, it's still out there. And if it has some strange game it likes to play, well, let's just pray I'm not the next piece. My name is Adam Robinson and I am 32 years old. I was a park ranger in the Congaree National Park in South Carolina. It's a strange, beautiful place, the Congaree. Ancient trees draped in Spanish moss stand knee-deep in swamp water. The air is thick, heavy. You can almost feel it clinging to your skin. I always like solitude. That's why I liked my job, even with its discomforts. I had a wife once, Helen. She didn't understand my need for quiet, for space. She left for the city, said she needed noise to feel alive. One summer the tourists thinned out, leaving the park eerily quiet. Then the disappearances began. It started with a young couple, bird watchers from Ohio. Their car was found abandoned near the Western Lake trailhead, a half-eaten sandwich on the dashboard. The local sheriff, a man named Hank with a face like a weathered saddlebag, didn't think much of it. Folks wander off, he'd said, chewing on a toothpick. Swamp swallows them up. But then a lone hiker went missing, then a fisherman. The disappearances were too close together, too clean. No signs of struggle, no bodies. It went against the natural order of things. Even Hank started to feel uneasy. Something ain't right. He'd admitted one evening, his voice low. We were sitting on the porch of the ranger station, a rickety wooden structure that had seen better days. The air was thick with mosquitoes, their buzzing a constant irritant. "What are we going to do?" I asked, swatting at a mosquito that had landed on my arm. Hank took a long drag from his cigarette, the ember glowing orange in the fading light. "We wait," he said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "See if it shows itself. We didn't have to wait long." A few nights later, I was woken by a sound I'd never heard before. A deep, resonant thump, like something large hitting the ground. It came from the direction of the boardwalk, a raised wooden path that wound its way through the swamp. I grabbed my flashlight and my service revolver, my heart pounding in my chest. Stepping out onto the porch, I scanned the darkness. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying vegetation. The only sound was the chirping of crickets and the croaking of frogs. I shone my flashlight down the boardwalk, the beam cutting a swath through the darkness. There was nothing there. I started down the boardwalk, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I felt like I was being watched. The thump came again, closer this time. I stopped, shining my flashlight in the direction of the sound. There was a rustle in the undergrowth, then silence. I moved closer, my hand tightening around the butt of my revolver. Pushing aside a tangle of vines, I saw it. A footprint. But it wasn't a human footprint. It was far too large, too deep. The outline was indistinct, but it looked like it had been made by something with claws. I knelt down, examining the print more closely. It was still damp, the mud around it freshly disturbed. Whatever made it was close. I stood up, my heart racing. I had to get back to the station, Warren Hank. I turned to leave, but something stopped me. A feeling, a presence. I shone my flashlight over my shoulder. At first I saw nothing. Then I noticed it. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, moving among the trees. It was difficult to make out in the darkness, but it seemed to be large, humanoid in shape, but moving with an unnatural fluidity. It didn't make a sound, yet I could feel its presence like a weight on my chest. I raised my revolver, my finger tightening on the trigger. The shadow didn't respond. It just stood there, watching me. Then it moved. It darted forward with a speed that belied its size, disappearing behind a thicket of trees. I ran after it, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the darkness. I could hear it moving through the undergrowth ahead of me, branches snapping, leaves rustling. I emerged into a small clearing, my chest heaving. The shadow was gone. I scanned the trees, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There was no sign of it. I was about to turn back when I saw it. Hanging from a low-hanging branch, swaying gently in the breeze, was a piece of fabric. It was blue and white checkered, like the shirt one of the missing hikers had been wearing. I approached the branch cautiously, my hand hovering over my revolver. As I got closer, I could see that the fabric was torn, shredded, like it had been ripped by something with claws. I shone my flashlight around the clearing again, my heart pounding in my chest. The clearing was empty, but I could feel it. Whatever it was still out there, watching me. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs screamed for mercy. I didn't stop until I reached the relative safety of the ranger station. I burst through the door, gasping for breath. Hank looked up from his chair, startled. "What is it?" he asked, his hand going to his holster. "It's out there," I managed to say between breaths. Something took them." Hank's face hardened. "Tell me everything." I told him about the footprint, the shadow, the piece of fabric. When I was finished, Hank was silent for a moment, his jaw clenched. "We need to call the state police," he said finally. "This is bigger than both of us." I nodded, my heart still racing. "I'll get on the radio." But when I reached for the radio, I realized it was dead. The battery, which I had just changed that morning, was completely drained. "What the—" Hank came up beside me, his face grim. "What is it?" "The radio," I said, shaking my head. "It's dead." Hank swore under his breath. "We need to get to my truck," he said. "There's a CB in there. We can use that." We stepped out onto the porch, the humid night air washing over us. The forest was alive with the sounds of insects, but there was an underlying stillness that was unsettling. And then we saw it. The shadow. It was standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the porch light. It was taller than I remembered, its outline indistinct in the darkness. It didn't move, but its presence seemed to press down on us, suffocating us. Hank drew his revolver. "Get inside," he said, his voice low and urgent, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my gaze fixed on the shadow. It took a step closer. "David." Hank's voice was sharp, commanding. I tore my gaze away from the shadow and looked at Hank. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a fear I'd never seen before. And then the shadow moved. It lunged forward with a speed that was almost impossible to follow, its form seeming to blur in the darkness. There was a sickening thud, a gasp of surprise. Hank's body crumpled to the floor, his revolver clattering uselessly across the wooden planks. I stared down at him, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. Hank lay still, his chest a mangled mess of flesh and bone. A shadow stood over him for a moment, its form shifting, pulsating in the dim light. Then it turned its gaze on me. I felt a surge of terror, primal and all-consuming. I stumbled back, my hand reaching for the doorknob. My fingers closed around the cold metal, but I knew it was too late. The shadow was already upon me. I scrambled back, tripping over Hank's body. The doorknob slips from my grasp. I'm trapped. The thing hesitates for a moment, as if considering its next move. It's then I get a good look at it, a hulking silhouette, almost blending with the darkness, but I see it. Matted dark fur covers its body, limbs too long, twisted in ways that shouldn't be possible. Eyes glowing with a faint internal light fix on me. Panic floods me. I kick out, connecting with something solid. A roar, deep and primal, shakes the porch. The thing stumbles back, momentarily surprised. I use the opportunity, scrambling to my feet. I run, no time to think, just run. I hear it behind me, crashing through the undergrowth. Each step I expect to feel its weight on me, claws tearing, teeth sinking in. But I keep running. The forest blurs, moonlight filtering through the canopy, playing tricks on my eyes. I burst out of the trees onto the main park road. My chest burns, legs screaming for rest. But the creature, I can still hear it. I run until I can't run anymore, collapsing by the side of the road, gasping for air. I look back. Nothing, just a forest, silent and menacing. The state police arrive. They swarm the park, sirens cutting through the night. I tell them what I saw, what happened. They find Hank's body. They find other bodies deep in the swamp, bones picked clean. They search for days, weeks. But the thing, it's gone. Vanished without a trace. They never find it. I leave the park. Can't stand the sight of the trees, the smell of the swamp, the silence. I move to the city, just like Helen. Find a job, a small apartment, try to forget. But the city holds no comfort. The noise, once a welcome distraction, now grates on my nerves. I see the creature's eyes in every shadow, hear its roar in the traffic. People ask about that night, about what happened in the park. I tell them it was an animal, a bear driven mad by hunger. It's easier than explaining the truth. But I know what I saw. I saw the wampus cat. At least that's what the old-timers in the area called it. A creature of legend, whispered about around campfires. A beast with glowing eyes and a taste for human flesh. I used to scoff at such stories. Now I'm not so sure. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, the scent of damp earth and decay clinging to my nostrils. And I know, deep in my bones, that the wampus cat is still out there, waiting. This happened to me a couple of summers ago. I'm John Kepler, a high school history teacher who loves hiking. I decided to explore the Appalachian Trail, taking a break from the daily grind. My journey led me to Harper's Ferry, a historic town in West Virginia, where my adventure was about to take a terrifying turn. Meeting fellow hikers along the way, conversation flowed easily. Sarah Benteen and her friend, Mark Bannister, joined my hike, sharing similar interests. We laughed at each other's terrible hiking stories and bonded over our clumsiness on the trek. The deeper we ventured into the trail, the denser the vegetation became. Suddenly a pungent smell hit us like a ton of bricks. A few yards away, we discovered human remains. Panic rose in our throats as we decided to head back together and report the gruesome discovery. As night approached, we set up camp, keeping a cautious eye on our surroundings. We couldn't shake off an eerie feeling like someone was watching us. We kept conversations light in an attempt to ease our nerves. "I think it has been years since that poor soul died," Sarah whispered. "Don't you find it creepy how untouched their belongings are?" "Let's try not to think about it," Mark replied with a nervous chuckle. The next morning felt peculiarly quiet as we resumed our hike back toward civilization. Soon enough, guttural shrieks pierced the silence, animal-like noises that made our hair stand on end. "We need to get out of here," I screamed, running through the dense forest, trying to escape this unseen terror. Every rustle seemed to be growing closer until we stumbled upon another hiker, pale and panting, gasping for breath. "My name is Lena Volkov. You need to leave this place immediately," she cried. My friends were slaughtered by these things. They crave human flesh. These words deepened our dread, but we knew we could not leave Lena behind. She joined our desperate retreat, fear propelling us further toward safety. Without warning, a monstrous figure lunged from the trees, scratching at Mark's face. He fell, and we had no choice but to flee deeper into the woods, leaving him fight for his life. This was survival. As we ran, we heard George Fitzgerald's voice, another hiker we had met at the trail's start. Crippled with injury, he hoarsely whispered that these mountain men could only be stopped with a lethal shot to the head. Nightfall enveloped us once more, as more horrifying noises blended with gut-wrenching screams echoing throughout the forest. All around us, leaves whispered dark secrets, while malevolent eyes stared from a distance. With Lena and Sarah clutching homemade weapons, I brandished my concealed firearm, a last resort against these cannibalistic mountain men who've chosen us as their latest prey. Our hearts raced as sweat dripped down our faces, and with each crunch of leaves beneath our feet, we wondered whether it would be our last escape attempt. We pressed further into the woods, our makeshift weapons and my concealed firearm offering a fleeting comfort. Sarah and Lena led the way, pausing occasionally to listen, their eyes darting around in search of lurking shadows. "Why aren't we calling for help?" Lena asked, her voice trembling with fear. "Because," I replied, catching my breath. "Our phones have no signal here. We're on our own." It was eerily quiet, and each footstep felt like crossing a thin ice sheet that could break any moment. As we cautiously proceeded, we heard faint groans in the near distance. The mountain men were close. "I see one," whispered Sarah gravely. Ahead lay a disheveled man with unkempt hair and a wild look in his eyes. He looked desperate, deranged even. As he stalked towards us, it became apparent that this was one of the cannibalistic mountain men out to torment us. Our hearts pounded rhythmically with each step he took towards us. We hastily fashioned a plan to evade him by circling around through the brush. But our efforts proved futile when another figure emerged from between the trees, blocking our path. Their distinguishable features were evident now. Long, unkempt beards mixed with unbridled ferocity, fueled by some perverse hunger for human flesh. Deciding there was no time to be passive, I fired a shot into the air as a warning. Better them know we had weapons than catch us by surprise later. The gunshot only seemed to spur them further. 3 more appeared behind us, towering men wielding crude clubs fashioned from gnarled branches and rusted nails, an odious reminder of their last meal. We backed away as quickly as we could without running blindly into another group of these horrifying cannibals lurking in the obsidian darkness. The moon offered feeble light to guide our escape, but we knew it was only a matter of time before we encountered more of them. "Our best chance is to find a way off the trails and back to our car," I insisted. Sarah and Lena nodded, bracing themselves for the harrowing gauntlet ahead. We moved carefully, keeping a low profile and treading lightly to dampen any noise. As dawn approached, so did the further edges of the woods. At one point we crossed paths with 2 more cannibals, but this time we were stealthier, hiding in the bushes until they passed without sparing us a single glance. By sunrise, hope returned to our world-weary hearts. We soon discovered a dirt road that led downhill, closer to where we started. Our legs burned with all too welcome fatigue as we trekked towards safety. Vehicles appeared from behind highway trees. "We made it," I whispered, overcome with relief. While waiting for emergency services to arrive, we recounted the horrors of the night in hushed tones. Sarah contacted Mark's family to inform them of his death indirectly, and resolved to provide stronger details once it was safe. We would never forget his advice about stopping these sadistic mountain men, a warning that potentially saved our lives. Traumatized by our ordeal but grateful for having escaped with our lives, Sarah, Lena, and I vowed never to venture onto mountain trails again. Instead, we would work tirelessly within our community to warn others about returning home safely from these ever-hungry predators lurking in the distant woods. A nightmare composed entirely from human roots, rather than supernatural tales or folklore beliefs. And every year since then, on an evening spent safely within 4 walls instead of outdoors, amidst nature's shadows and perils beyond human comprehension, We pay tribute to those who had fallen victim to the merciless grasp of these cannibalistic mountain men who still roam these lands. A haunting memory of the night that changed our lives forever. The year was 1988, and I found myself in the heart of the Louisiana swamps, not too far from Baton Rouge. A fishing trip with an old friend. That's all it was meant to be. My name's Silas Crowfeather, Ojibwe, on my mother's side. I spent most of my life working the rigs up north. Figured it was about time to take a break before my knees gave out for good. Now Bobby, my buddy, swore blind this was the best spot for catfish you could find for 100 miles. All I saw was muddy water and mosquitoes big enough to carry off a small dog. It was getting toward dusk, with those long swamp shadows turning the Spanish moss a sickly gray, when Bobby got his first bite. He whooped with excitement as he wrestled the thing to shore. Whatever it was, it had put up one hell of a fight. When he finally hauled it up on the bank, it wasn't a catfish, not by a long shot. I'd never seen anything like it. Scaly, slick skin, dark as midnight, with a long eel-like body, but that's where the resemblance ended. Its head was flat as a shovel, and its eyes, beady and black, sat too far apart, giving it a freakish, unnatural stare. The thing had a maw full of needle-like teeth, and it was thrashing and biting, making a sound more hiss than growl. "What the hell is that?" I asked, backing away. Even with the light fading, I could see something was seriously wrong with the creature, revealing raw, weeping flesh, and there was a foul smell clinging to it, like something rotten left out in the sun too long. "Damned if I know," Bobby said, a note of unease creeping into his voice. "Never seen nothing like it in all my years crawling through these swamps." He was about to toss it back in when that sickly thing lunged forward and sank its teeth into his hand. Bobby yelped, a stream of curses pouring from his mouth. We both scrambled to try and pry the creature loose, but it held fast, its little teeth digging deep into his flesh. Finally, I grabbed my pocket knife and saw it at its neck. The creature released its grip with a wet-sounding snap, leaving behind a gory wound on my friend's hand. The damn thing didn't die, though. It slithered back towards the water's edge with surprising speed, hissing in fury as it went. "After it," Bobby shouted, cradling his bleeding hand, his face pale. I chased the creature knife in hand, but it was too slick. It disappeared into the murky depths, leaving us staring at the ripples where it vanished. Bobby swore, wrapped his bleeding hand in a grimy bandana, and insisted that we had to head back to the truck for proper first aid. I didn't put up much of an argument. That whole scene had left me rattled. It wasn't just the attack. Something about that creature was off. In a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. There was a wrongness to it, a feeling it wasn't supposed to exist. Back at the truck, we tended to Bobby's wound as best we could, the whole time replaying the encounter in our heads. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. Something wasn't right in those swamps, a darkness lingering at the edge. On the drive back to town, we saw a lone figure hunched by the side of the road. Even in the fading light, something looked peculiar about the way it moved. Too jerky, too disjointed. My heart sank in my chest. I'd grown up on the reservation, heard enough stories from the elders to last a lifetime. This thing, it wasn't an animal. It wasn't an animal at all. "Don't stop," I told Bobby, my voice tight. "Just keep driving." He gave me a questioning look, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. He must have been feeling it too, that unnatural chill in the air. As we passed, the figure turned its head to look at the truck. The headlights illuminated its face for a brief, terrifying instant. It was an old woman, but her eyes, they were the same flat, cold black as that swamp creature. Her face split into a hideous grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Bobby slammed his foot on the gas pedal, and the truck lurched forward. I watched the figure recede into the rearview mirror, feeling my stomach churn. We hadn't come across an old woman in the middle of nowhere. We'd run into the same monstrous entity that had attacked Bobby. In a different, equally grotesque form. Back in Baton Rouge, we bandaged Bobby's hand properly, neither of us saying a word about what we'd both seen. We passed it off as some local fish, mutated from swamp pollution or a forgotten chemical spill. Lies, we told ourselves to sleep at night. Over the next few days, the bite on Bobby's hand festered instead of healing. He started getting feverish, talking nonsense, his whole demeanor shifting. There was a gleam in his eyes that scared me, like he was turning into something else. One night he vanished from his motel room. We searched high and low, called the police, but he was nowhere to be found. Bobby was gone, swallowed by the Louisiana swamps. I drove straight back to Minnesota and didn't look back, but nightmares followed me. Images of that swamp monster, its dead eyes and gnashing teeth, visions of Bobby transforming into something monstrous, his eyes turning that same chilling black. The whispers of old reservation tales drifted back to me, stories of skinwalkers, of shapeshifters that walk the line between man and beast. They say you can spot them by the eyes. I knew deep down that whatever dwelled in those Louisiana swamps wasn't just some freak of nature. It was old and dark and hungry, and it was still out there. A month later, I was flipping through the newspaper at my local diner, half-heartedly nursing a tepid cup of coffee, when an article caught my eye. A string of disappearances in southern Louisiana. Hikers lost in the swamps, locals vanishing without a trace. And in the grainy photo accompanying the piece, I saw it. Those chilling, beady black eyes staring back at me. The paper gave some bland explanation, wild animals or a serial killer on the loose. I knew better. The coffee turned sour in my stomach. Something tells me my fishing days in the South are done. But that evil lingering in the swamps, the thing that took my friend, it might not stay local forever. That newspaper article became my call to action. I felt it, that same itching in my bones, the hunter in me awakening after a long slumber. This thing, whatever it was, had to be stopped. I packed my truck with essentials, supplies, hunting gear, and a few old silver weapons passed down from my great-grandfather, a Navajo silversmith. If the reservation tales were true, if this creature had a weakness, it would be silver. The drive back to Louisiana felt different this time. I wasn't a fisherman on vacation anymore, but a hunter on the trail of a deadly foe. The air itself seemed to crackle with a strange energy the closer I got to those cursed swamps. In the nearest town, I sought out folks willing to talk. I played it off as an academic interest in local legends, a city boy fascinated by those swamp devil rumors. Most scoffed and rolled their eyes, but a few, the ones with haunted looks in their eyes, they whispered tales, stories about loved ones who vanished into the cypress trees and never returned. About strange tracks, sightings of creatures that couldn't be real. They confirmed my fears. Whatever stalked those swamps wasn't simply preying on fish or stray animals anymore. It had developed a taste for human flesh. Word spread quickly in small towns. A local elder, a woman named Elise with knowing eyes and wrinkles earned over many hard years, found me at the rundown motel where I'd set up camp. She didn't question my motivations. There was a weary understanding in her gaze, a recognition of the shadows I was battling. Her voice was rough, laced with both caution and a weary resignation. My people have a long history with that beast. It goes back generations. This was the first time I heard the name Ruggeru. I committed it to memory. Elise told me what she could. Fragments of legends, clues passed down through her family. The Ruggeru, she said, was no mere monster. It was an ancient spirit, twisted and insatiable, born from human corruption. Those marked by the Ruggeru bitten, infected, whatever you want to call it, could shapeshift, taking bestial forms. Some legends claimed it was a curse passed down like a terrible disease. Others said it was a bargain made in darkness, a human soul traded for monstrous power. Can it be killed? I asked, my hand itching towards the silver-handled hunting knife at my belt. Elise shook her head. It cannot die. We've tried. For centuries we've tried, but you can drive it back, force it to retreat to the darkest corners of the swamp. It will always hunger, always seek to spread its corruption, but if you are strong, you can buy our people precious time. That is all any of us can hope for. Her words settled heavy in my heart. This wasn't a fight with a clean end, but that didn't mean it wasn't worth having. Armed with the local knowledge Elise shared, and with weapons both modern and steeped in old traditions, I ventured into the swamps. I followed tracks, listened for sounds that didn't belong, felt the prickling of unseen eyes on me in the dead of night. I moved with the caution of a seasoned hunter, the knowledge that one misstep could be my last. After days of searching, I found it. Not the creature from the murky water, and not the hunched figure from the roadside. This form was different yet again, a travesty of a man, hunched and feral, eyes replaced by that terrible black emptiness. It was Bobby, or what remained of him, his humanity lost to the Rougarou's corrupting touch. My heart twisted with a gut-wrenching mixture of rage and sorrow. There was nothing left of my friend in that thing, only a monstrous vessel for an ancient evil. He didn't recognize me, just snarled and lunged. The fight was brutal. Bob possessed a strength far beyond a human's unnatural speed and a killer's instinct. I landed blows, but my knives and rifle did little but slow it down. Finally, in desperation, I drew my great-grandfather's silver knife. It was a gamble, a shot in the dark. As the blade pierced its flesh, the creature let out a piercing shriek, a sound that seemed to shake the swamp itself. Black ichor spurted from the wound, and smoke rose from its skin. The Rougarou thrashed in pain, its movements frantic. I seized the opportunity, lunging forward with the knife and bearing it to the hilt. The creature howled in agony, its form flickering and distorting as it tried to shift again. It fell to the muddy ground, its movements growing weaker with each passing second. Then with a final shudder it went still. The black eyes blinked, and for a flicker of a second I saw not a monster, but Bobby staring in confusion from the eyes of a dying beast. A flicker, then that light faded, leaving behind empty, lifeless orbs. The aftermath was a blur. I burned the remains both for safety and for the sake of my friend's soul, as best I could. Elise and the local hunters swore an oath of secrecy, protecting the town from further panic. The disappearances continued, likely forever, but at least for now, the Rougarou lay dormant somewhere in the heart of the swamp. That at least was something. I returned to my life up north. My nightmares never truly faded. Sometimes in the quiet hours I swear I can hear the rustling of leaves, the cracking of swamp muck underfoot, and feel those beady black eyes studying me from the shadows. Maybe the Rougarou's spirit lingers, searching for a new host, a new way to spread its corrupting influence. Or maybe it's just my fear playing tricks on me, the echo of that fight ringing in my ears forever. The one thing I know for certain is that my days as an ordinary working man are over. The world is a darker place than I ever realized, and somewhere out there, in the swamps or the shadows of cities, ancient evils lurk and hunger,